A little class. A bell woke me. "Good morning," Torchy called from across the room in a disgustingly cheerful voice. I coughed a couple of times as I sat up, wondering why my lungs felt like I'd spent the night in an ashtray. The answer sat in the bottom of my wastebasket. I stared at the charred ball of paper that had once been a student handbook. "Hey, are you trying to kill us?" I asked Torchy. "I didn't do nothing," he said. Right. There was no point in arguing. We just get into one of those did two things that didn't go anywhere. So I dropped it and got ready for my day at Edgeview. My first class after breakfast was math. When I reached the door, Cheater waved to me from the middle of the empty room. "I got us some seats," he said. "Thanks." I plunked down next to him. I was afraid I'd have to stand. "I'm not going to copy off of you," Cheater added. "Everyone says I do, but I don't." "Fine." I didn't care if he copied from me. Torchy grabbed the seat on my other side. He'd sort of attached himself to me. That was okay. I didn't mind sticking with someone who knew what was going on, and compared to a lot of the kids I'd seen, he was reasonably normal. If you didn't count his slight problem with fire. Besides, he was so relentlessly friendly that being mean to him would be like kicking a puppy. He didn't act like those kids who ask, "Will you be my friend?" Now those kids, I don't mind kicking. With Torchy, it was more like he was saying, "I'm going to be your friend," and I didn't see any point fighting it. Bloodbath wasn't in my math class, but I saw 3 kids just like him sitting in the back row. They all had the same deadly look. One had rings in his nose and in both eyebrows. He might have had a ring in his tongue, too, but I didn't really want to get close enough to see for sure. I didn't even want him to see me looking in his direction. His buddy had a tattoo of a skull on his forehead. It looked like he'd done it himself. Just the thought of a needle being jabbed over and over into my flesh made me shudder. I wondered if his pea-sized brain realized the humor of putting a skull on the outside of his own skull. Probably not. The third beast in that cluster of thugs had grunge tattooed on the back of each hand. As far as I could tell, none of them carried any books to class. "Here comes Mr. Parsons," Torchy whispered as the teacher stepped into the room. "Careful. He's got a bit of a temper." A teacher with a temper? Now that was a shock. I watched Mr. Parsons walk to his desk. He pretty much looked like any of the million other middle-aged math teachers, except for the long strands of hair that he'd combed over the top of his head from the side. He was wearing a rumpled green jacket, rumpled green pants, and a blue tie. Not a bow tie, but I still didn't trust him. "Good morning, class," he said. There was no answer, but about half the kids at least glanced in his direction. One kid, I learned later that they called him Flying Dan, was running around at the back of the room with his arms spread out like airplane wings. Another was carving something on his desk with his pen. At least he was doing that until the pen snapped from the pressure. Here we go, and this is the drawing on the desk. One second, guys. A couple of kids stared out the windows. I guess I was looking all around the room at everybody else. Mr. Parsons cleared his throat. I faced forward and tried to escape his notice. "Be cool," I told myself. "Just sit back and get through it." That was my plan. "Well, now I see we have a new student," Mr. Parsons said, glancing down at the sheet of paper he'd taken from his lesson book. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on me. Not a tough trick to pull off, since I wasn't a moving target like Flying Dan. "Martin, why don't you tell the class something about yourself?" I shrugged. There's really nothing to tell. I hated the whole new kid song and dance routine. Stand up, stutter a bit, say something totally stupid, sit down. What did he think I was, a dancing dog? "Come on, don't be modest. Surely you have something interesting to share." I shook my head. At least I wasn't the center of attention. In the class, there was no center of attention, just one bubble in a glass of cola clinging to the side while a giant soda straw of a teacher tried to stir things around and suck us up. Parsons shuffled over to me and smiled a thin smile. His upper lip was nearly the same pasty color as his forehead. His head reminded me of the belly of a dead fish. "Now, Martin, one of the basic things that we've discovered at Edgeview is that the students must learn to be open and honest about themselves. Open and honest, that's the key. Please, stand up and share something." He leaned over and patted me on the shoulder, then returned to the front of the class and crossed his arms. His whole body said, "I'm waiting." It looked like there was no way out. I stared at him, staring straight ahead of me. acting all powerful and filled with expert ideas and theories about what was right for us poor little students. Open and honest? As I rose to my feet, I realized that was the perfect description. I honestly had no idea what was going to come out when I opened my mouth. Cliffhanger. Hi, my name's Martin Anderson, and I'm not bald. I sat back down. Mr. Parsons' face grew red. Even the top of his scalp, through the strands of combed-over hair, turned the color usually only seen in ripe garden tomatoes. His face wasn't changing color. His face wasn't just changing color, it was also twitching, like in the monster movies right before the guy turns into a werewolf. I expected him to start shouting, but he whirled away from me, fumbled around for some chalk, and wrote the lesson on the board. He broke 3 pieces before he was finished. I glanced over at Torchy. He held his finger up like a knife and ran it across his throat. Then he flopped his tongue out, closed his eyes, and dropped his head onto one shoulder. I guess that was his subtle way of telling me that I'd probably not made a good first impression on Mr. Parsons. Way to go, Cheater whispered. Yeah, way to go. The class itself was pretty strange. I guess it was some kind of experimental teaching method. The idea seemed to be that we could learn math better if we didn't have to spend so much time memorizing stuff and just used numbers in lots of different ways. I wasn't sure whether it would work, but I was willing to give it a try, and I certainly didn't want to get any further out on Mr. Parsons' bad side if that was possible. So I paid attention. I even raised my hand once or twice, though he didn't call on me. Things didn't stay peaceful for long. About halfway through the class, Mr. Parsons handed back some tests. When Cheater got his, he shouted, "It's not fair!" He jumped up, knocked over his desk, kicked his chair, and rushed from the room. Nobody paid any attention, not even the teacher. I glanced at the test where it had landed on the floor. On top, written in red, there was a large F. Then I looked over at Torchy. "He'll be back," Torchy said. Sure enough, Cheater returned a few minutes later, acting as if nothing had happened. He put his desk back and sat down. The bell rang. "Wow, you sure know how to blend in," Cheater said as we were leaving for our next class. He raced ahead. "Yeah," Torchy said. "Parsons looked like he wanted to strangle you." I shrugged. "He'll get over it. I didn't really say anything all that bad. I hope the other teachers aren't that sensitive." "Is his class always like this?" Torchy shook his head. "Parsons keeps trying different stuff. Last month we had to learn a bunch of songs about fractions. There was one jingle that I can't get out of my head." "You're kidding." He shook his head. "I wish I was." Before I could ask him about our next class, someone punched me on the shoulder hard enough to knock me into a wall. All right, so here we have Form 937-C, Edgeview School, for official use only. New student preliminary evaluation form. Student name, Martin Anderson. Evaluation, a vicious and destructive boy. That's my impression. He'll require close watching. I've met few students who are as unruly and ill-mannered. Evaluator, Mr. Luther Parsons. Okay, and this is our next chapter. It's really short, so I'm just going to put it in this